So I will get the recording going and pass it on to Nora.
Oh, thank you very much. I think that we're going to pass it to Jody, who will pass it to me, but sharing's caring.
I think that you were going to start, Nora. There's a few words you're going to say, and then I will take over, but go ahead.
Oh, am I starting? Oh, here, I'm totally starting. It's fine. It's fine. Happy summer, everyone. My brain is on vacation. Welcome to the first Women of Nature Community of Practice, emphasize practice, webinar for 2023, Leading with Confidence. I'm Nora Livingstone. I am part of the membership steering committee. It's a whole committee. Thankfully, it's not just me, because I would be telling people they're doing it wrong when they're doing it right. I'm here to moderate for our first webinar. We have three wonderful panelists, Maggy Burns, Cadungog, and Sherry Yano, who I'll introduce in one moment. This is our first of three webinars. The topic today is going to be leading with confidence. The topics of interest for our webinar today are based on the feedback of all of our mentees. So now I'm going to pass it over to Jody. Thank you, and you're welcome.
Hello and welcome, everyone. As we come together for this exciting webinar, I'd like to start by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands we are on today. We acknowledge the importance of the lands which we each call home and have been traditionally stewarded by our Indigenous partners. From coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. But feel free to write in the chat to acknowledge where you're listening from today. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility for reconciliation, to improve the relationships between nations and our own understanding of Indigenous peoples and their cultures. I'd also like to take a moment to thank our sponsors, the Chalkers Foundation, RW&Co, Women for Nature donors, and of course, Pollinate Networks for allowing us the opportunity to host the leadership webinar series, and the efforts of the steering committee, which includes Nora and Gauri Srinivasan and Yvonne McKinnon. Now I'm going to pass it back to Nora to introduce today's panelists.
Thanks, Jody. Megwitch and Heichka. Maggy Burns is the Executive Director of the Ecology Action Centre and integral to its success over the past 2 decades. Maggy's nonprofit work experience spans sectors including entrepreneurship, environment, international development, youth, and experiential education. Cadungog is the Executive Director at the Foundation for Environmental Stewardship. Kat's executive responsibilities at FES allows her to create programming that gives space to voices left behind, and at the core, empower youth for a more inclusive, fair, and prosperous and sustainable future. Sherry Yano is the Director of Grants and Community Engagement at the Real Estate Foundation of BC. Sherry is a senior leader with 20 years of experience in the not-for-profit sector in developing and delivering integrated programming to drive collaborative, evidence-based solutions to complex issues. An engineer with a master's degree in planning, she's known for as a strong network builder. Sherry is a hard worker who excels at team leadership, enabling people to do their best work and to have strong collective impact. So we are so lucky to have these three speakers today. And I'm delighted to sit back and just listen and get so many answers to so many things. I'm really excited. Let's get started. I'm going to pose some questions to the panelists, and we'll open it up to participants to ask questions and comments later. The best way to do that is by raising your hand, the bottom button on the screen. We'll invite you to ask your questions and comments live at the end. You can also click the Q&A button and send your questions to the webinar host, Renata. Thanks, friend. Let's get started with our first series of questions. Panelists, please feel free to answer one of the most relevant question that I'm going to pose to you. So we have three. What do you think are the key characteristics of a good leader? Does empathy and vulnerability play a part in your leadership? If so, can you share an example? Or share what you think is meant by the phrase, the real way to grow power is to give it away. So I'm going to start with Maggie and then Kat and then finish with Sherry. So Maggie, let's get started.
Great. Thanks, Nora, and thanks, everyone. It's really fun to be here. Nice to talk about something that I know a lot about, which is my own leadership style. And so I think I would offer three things that I think are leadership strengths for me and that have served me really well. And I would also say that it's really important to lean into your own leadership strengths. And that is kind of the first point. So to me, a key leadership characteristic is awareness. So contextual awareness and ability to listen to the people around you, and also substantially self-awareness. So an ability to do the work of figuring out what's going on for you, so that you can bring that in a productive way. And so to me, that awareness includes an awareness of difference, and a recognition of the importance of that, and also a real awareness of your own power. Probably one of my first lessons in leadership when I moved into a director role was suddenly realizing that although I was doing many of the same things I had done before, now I had the power, and it really made a substantial, it's just a substantial shift. So awareness, self-awareness, and ability to ask for help would be a second one. Some of the best advice I got when I became an executive director was build yourself a team. Build yourself a team of peers who can mentor you in your leadership journey, but also if you're able to find someone, either a volunteer or a friend or a professional who can actually coach you, so someone who can listen to you and help you process some of the things that you're working on and strategize about your plans. And then the last thing I would say is that it's, for me, part of being in a leadership and management role is being okay to not know. And so it's not just about not knowing the answer, but it's about really doing your role, which does not mean knowing all of the details. It, in fact, for me, specifically means not knowing all of the details, and being comfortable not knowing the details. So that's a version of, delegating. But for me, it's a cast of mind around being comfortable at doing the parts of the job that are my job. And I think, just to touch a little bit on the question of empathy and vulnerability, I would say absolutely, those are incredibly key in leadership. And empathy is part of the good listening process in my mind. And vulnerability is one that I think a lot about, and finding the right balance of vulnerability to bring into your leadership. So what I aspire to not do is bring my drama and put it on my colleagues, because that is in fact not helpful. So how to find a space where I'm bringing my vulnerability and my humanity and, the basic day-to-day challenges of my life, as well as my vulnerability in the leadership space and questions, but not to the point where it's pulling the attention onto me when it doesn't need to be. I was trying to think of a quick example of vulnerability, and for me, the one from this week was I went through a process of a bit of a change process with the team, and I was getting a sense that some people were, maybe disagreeing with some parts of it. And the first part of me was like, oh, they're wrong. I've done it. I've thought it through. I know what's happening. And then I kind of reframed for myself, and I was like, actually, it's so important to invite that dissent and actually listen to it. And so I specifically reached out and said to those individuals who I thought had some concerns and invited some of that in. So it's not like a dramatic vulnerability, but it was me relating to, okay, yeah, I'm feeling attacked a bit by this negative feedback, but instead of shying away from it, I'm gonna jump into it. Anyway, since I went first, I'm not sure if that was like overly long or not, but I'll stop there, and I look forward to hearing the others and any questions.
Thank you so much, Maggie. It's so interesting to hear about vulnerability and the strength to say you don't know everything and to be able to show up in that way. So thank you for your vulnerability in your answer. Kat, we'll pass it to you.
Yeah, so loved Maggie's answer. And I think I also want to start off that you don't need to be assigned what is a typical leadership position in order to be a leader in your organization. You can step into that space, whether it's like internally in your team, it's something that you want to try out, or you're leading a specific project. A lot of times people are like, an executive director is a leader, a CEO is a leader, but really what an executive director does is we set direction based on what is needed by the community that we serve. And I think that's the really important thing to know about leadership. It's you were a leader because you were assigned that leadership position by your community, and it's very much so a bottom-up approach. A lot of people fall into positions of power or authority in two different respects, in two different ways. There's either top down, and top down says something along the lines of you are a subject matter expert. We're a team of perhaps program designers, but you're the environmental scientist that actually knows the nitty-gritty of the space. And in that way, you're a leader. So you're responsible for perhaps like relaying information, assigning specific tasks because you're the subject matter expert. But a lot of times with top-down approaches, people mistake subject matter expert of knowing a particular topic as to being a subject matter expert as into the sector at large without actually consulting the community that they serve. And authority mostly comes from more so a bottom-up approach. How are you actually engaging with community and actually aligning yourself and your organization with the community that you're meant to serve? Because really that's how democracies work. Like we are assigned leadership positions through the communities that we serve. And in that way, that's why leadership really should be framed around empathy and vulnerability, because it's not about this distinction between leaders and followers. It's about being in community and knowing that all you're doing is really setting direction, and you can't set direction unless you're with people. So I think that's a really key component of leadership. And in my work, we do this all the time. I mean, we have our youth steering committee. Every time something comes up that perhaps might be a little bit of a sticky or spicy topic, we create a culture within our own foundation, within our own organization, where it's appropriate and always proper to consult with community before we make any huge substantial decision, whether it comes to getting funding from perhaps an unsavory source or not a savory source. Like those are things that you need to talk to community about. And when I think about this phrase, the real way to grow power is to give it away, I think, backtracking a little bit from that question, a lot of times people look at leadership and resources as it's very scarce. Like we have a scarcity mindset in the space that only specific people are chosen to be leaders. But for what reason? Or are they just chosen? Are they primed? Are they biologically wired that way? Are there only meant to be a certain amount of leaders? And that's simply not the case. We need to move away from this scarcity mindset and say we're in these positions of power, leadership, so that we can make space for other people to step into their own variations or definitions of leadership and flourish in their communities, whether that is, patriarchally defined as leadership or however we choose to define leadership for ourselves. So that would be my answer to that question.
Thank you so much, Kat. The idea of decolonizing even these words and going from consultation to consent is something that's so interesting, and I'm so glad you brought it up. I'm already taking wild notes. Sherry, we'll pass the microphone to you.
Thanks so much. Yeah, it is such a pleasure to be here. And I've just loved listening to the first two, to Maggie and to Kat. And just, I had some stuff in my mind when I was listening to the questions that I was gonna say, but I think I'm just gonna toss that away. And really, for me, I've moved over from like decades in NGO work to recently into philanthropy. And as you probably all know, like philanthropy is a very different sector. Like I feel like I have a lot to learn and I really appreciate the work that people do, but there is an inherent power differential. You know, we all know it from that other side of the table where you're grant seeking or funding seeking. And I really appreciated what Kat said about power, and also Maggie, like understanding the power that you bring and trying to level that out, because ultimately in philanthropy, at least, you know, we don't have a job or work unless there's community leadership, unless there's great leadership. Like our job is to support leadership. And it really is about turning that conventional power dynamic on its head and trying to move that as quickly as you can through whatever power structures there are within your own organization. So I do think it is about how do you serve your team so that they are feeling very empowered, and how do they in turn, and you as well, but serve those communities that you're really meant to support and lift up, and appreciate that leadership and kind of go beyond that transactional relationship of money and whatever reports and whatever that is, to really find out like how can you be a good partner to communities, how can you really lift them up and in the ways that are meaningful to them, and how can you learn all of that and earn the right to work with folks in community. I do think trust is really important, because that building of trust, it takes time within a team, but also with the people you're trying to serve. But I do think that empathy and vulnerability, as part of your question, are deeply a part of, you know, the conditions, as well as cultural safety and training. And, you know, there's probably even deep listening. I think there's a lot of ways that we can shift power. And in the end, like all show up as leaders. And I know that sounds kind of kumbaya, but like we all have roles to play. And how can we show up that kind of just basically allows everyone to come to the table and create the best ways forward possible? And what's our role in that? How can we create the culture, the trust, that climate of empathy and vulnerability where those things can flourish? So I'll pass it back to to the next question, I guess.
Oh, thank you, Sherry. I love all these answers, and what sort of jumped out at me was, and I wrote it down, so I'm clearly going to read it, is earning the right to work with community. And so often in these patriarchal ideas of leadership, there's just, I got here because I worked really hard, and there's not a lot of talk about trust, and there isn't talk about the vulnerability that on both sides when a community trusts you, when you trust the community. And so I love just the expansiveness that this can bring, and the lack of scarcity mindset that that's so often in business people talk about. So thank you very much for your answers. Thank you, everyone. There's so many nuggets. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. So for question 2, describe how you motivate people, encourage consensus building and collaboration. How do you foster a culture of inclusion and belonging to recognize and enable leadership from all? Is it something just for EDs and CEOs to lead on, or how can we ensure people from different parts of the organization contribute? So we've already started this conversation, which is so deeply interesting. So we'll start with Sherry, and then we'll go to Kat, and then Maggie. So Sherry, what do you have to say?
Thanks, Nora. I kind of like being in that last position, because then you can really rip off these amazing answers that people give before you. So I guess obviously the answer is that leadership doesn't come from CEOs and EDs. Like it does, and they have a role to play, but everybody has a role to play. And also, like, I think sometimes when we think that because we look at some org chart that is like borrowed from or taken from the corporate models with the CEO or ED at the top and then senior management and stuff like that, you know, it sucks our accountability up, a lot of our work, our effort, our thinking, if we just take that at face value, and it can really put us in a bad position psychologically, thinking we have less power, especially if we're coming in at entry level, which is not true. Like, you know, it's not really the right thing for any of us to leave it to just the AD or the CEO to set that right culture, be it of service, empowerment, like, you know, thinking of justice, whatever it is. Like, it's not a single person's, it's not within their ability to set that kind of culture. It's like, really, it does take everybody coming to the table and, you know, as Kat said, really looking for that mandate from the community and direction and the decision making. And so I really think that, you know, it's not just, the answer isn't just, no, it's not just a CEO or ED, but it's actually like, the danger of that, like following an org chart and thinking you have less power, is that then you don't take it, you don't participate fully in trying to create the culture that you really want to see, and that allows everybody to thrive. And sometimes when you're not placed at the top, you can even see it better. You can see avenues of how people could be more empowered, how community could have more role. You're maybe at the front lines, you're interfacing more with community and understand things more. So I would just say it's really important to create that culture, like to create the connections that your organization needs, and not to just look at an org chart and assume that you have less power than you actually do. So I'll leave it there.
Oh, thank you so much, Sherry. And yeah, it's just so important for all of us to see all the leadership we have in all parts of our life, and yeah, not just this triangle org chart, perhaps a circle or something else. Kat, I'm going to pass it to you.
Yeah, so this to me is a really interesting question, because I find a lot of people's relationship with work is changing, right? Like it's no longer the center of people's lives, and a lot of care is being injected into these places. And, you know, sometimes it is difficult. Like, I think especially stepping into a leadership role, a lot of times folks feel responsible for the care of the rest of their workers and for the people that are part of their company and their community, their organization. And that can be really hard for a leader, to be honest, taking on that emotional burden of perhaps the folks, the staff, and the people that they work for them. And I think one of the things that has always worked for me in the space, like, how do you motivate people, encourage consensus building and collaboration in spaces where we also need to be mindful of providing care for people in the best way that we can, is first of all, of course, setting boundaries within our work. Like, it is a professional space, and I feel like sometimes people just don't want to name that. People are sometimes afraid to name that a professional workspace isn't necessarily responsible for providing you with all of the things. However, it's really important to talk about relational accountability. And this is something that I heard from some Indigenous partners that we had. It's like really understanding our relationships to those people, to that organization, and understand the accountability structures surrounding it. With relational accountability, you have to really kind of map out, who are we accountable to? Obviously accountable to ourselves, of course, accountable to our staff, but overall accountable to the mission of the organization. And to motivate people, you need to really make sure that people feel some accountability to the mission and the outcome of the organization, not just you as a leader, but to the overall mission of what you're actually trying to pursue. That is the greatest motivator for anybody entering into an organization or company, because they feel they themselves feel seen in the mission that you as a leader, are actively trying to pursue. And that is the best way to motivate people, and also include them in these talks with community. Like, yes, it's the job of the leader to always be interfacing with community, but how do you actually loop people into the discussion so they're aware strategically at every single point why certain and specific decisions are being made? Because there's nothing worse than just kind of following a leader blindly and not really knowing what direction we're actually taking. And in that way, you're creating a culture of inclusion, right? You're providing spaces and opportunities to be, and kind of moments, I would say, for people that are doing things on the ground within your organization to then kind of very much so understand strategy while also interfacing with community. So you get a more holistic view of like what is actually happening in the organization, why there might be ebbs and flows of work, but also providing space for people to express if they have some overload, how developing plans with them. What we always do internally is like when we set deadlines, we always ask the question, is this reasonable? And we set deadlines together and set deadlines collaboratively, because it's really hard at the same time for leaders to always know what's going on in the day-to-day of people. And sometimes deadlines can truly just be out of touch with the people that are meant to be advancing this mission. And that's when you get a lot of conflict. So creating a culture of that dialogue between people, program managers, project designers, and everybody on the team, so it really feels like a team effort. And we have a relational accountability to each other to advance mission. And then in that way, you feel like you belong. And from an equity perspective, I mean, it's about inviting these different conceptions of time, diverse perspectives to it. And inviting also an idea of vulnerability, of actually saying that we don't know how to attack this particular issue. Help me to understand how I can help you. I think that's really important for us to kind of create a dialogue internally about like how, in what way do you like to be managed, and what way do you like to be included? What does belonging look like to you? What does leadership look like to you within the organization? And we have check-in points. Like we have, like every time somebody is hired, we set like a strategic plan for them. Like, yes, these are KPIs or professional goals, but personally, what do you also want to achieve within the organization? What provides you fulfillment within the organization? Because that's a new framing of, you know, us also tracking like how we actually not necessarily fulfilling somebody. I think that's an impossible task for anybody to do, but filling up their cup just a little bit more. So the last question, is this something just for EDCOs to lead on, or how can we engage others? This is a team effort. Once again, leaders are just advancing a strategic direction in the patriarchal sense, like EDs and CEOs. But overall, everybody on the team, I find, really needs to be motivated and clear on direction and mission to feel as if they're part of it.
Thank you so much, Kat. Yeah, again, the idea of having just the culture of inclusion means collaboration and understanding the different conceptions of time and issues. And I love what you said about everyone understanding why they're doing something, from community members to the ED to everyone that's working. And just having this culture of collaboration means that we're all leading in some way. The ED doesn't have to be a wizard that knows everything, because we're all working together. And Maggie, I would love to ask you to talk on this as well.
Thanks. And that was so great to hear from the other two panelists. Trying to think what to add. I mean, I really resonate with some of what Kat brought up around the emotional burden of leadership, and how to create some boundaries around that, or some ability to share that load in a just way. And I maybe alluded to this a bit before, but I really see that the executive director or leadership role, it's just a role. And I mean, I don't want to diminish the power structure that almost inevitably attaches to it because of the broken systems that we work within, but I still really do think it is just, for me, it is a set of things that I am responsible for. I am responsible for this, and this strategy, for example. And someone else is responsible for something just as important, but it's just a different set of responsibilities. So I think that's a really fundamental part of the way I try to think about leadership. some examples that I thought might be interesting, because I do think the question includes how do you foster a culture. And I think for collaboration, a lot of it is culture. I mean, we balance between culture and processes and policies. And so when I'm orienting folks to the organization, I have a really intentional piece of work that I do with them around culture. What are the observations they have of the organization's culture? And I invite people into that process of co-creating the culture right from the start. Like culture is something that we all make together. And so I try to kind of inspire people to do that right from the beginning, and to think about culture as something that they have a role in. I think another piece, and maybe this was touched on already, is the importance of transparency, particularly as a leader where you have access to a lot of information and you make certain decisions, but it's not always clear to folks why that might be happening. So I don't know, one of the things that I do that's a kind of a more part of the cycle of the year is I'll do kind of a exposition around our organizational budget at the beginning of each year. So we set that budget, and then I will sometimes do updates for folks so that people have some sight lines into that part of the organization. Because part of being in that co-creation is, if the only person that knows all that stuff is the ED or the ED and the board, then you really can't co-create in a meaningful way. So I think that's really important. And then I would just say, you know, a lot of it's about balance, finding that balance as a leader, I think. And I think it's maybe a bit cliched, but like balance isn't a state, it's a constant moving from place to place to find your balance. And so, you know, I was in a meeting with a team the other day, and there was a suggestion that I was like, oh no, absolutely not that. So, you know, in my attempt to find balance, I really look to see what is useful and meaningful that I can pull from that, and can I do a yes and. So for me, that's a bit of the balance between being like a patriarchal or a top-down leader where I'm like, nope, thanks for your suggestion, but absolutely not, and being a more empathy and relational leader where it's like, okay, what is that person offering in there, which is different from what I have to offer, and how do I pull something helpful out of that? Sometimes you can't do that, or it's important that you don't, and you have to say, no, that's not how we're going, it's not appropriate. But sometimes you can do the yes and really look for what's being offered to you from the things that you don't immediately agree with. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Maggie. Yeah, I think all of these are such rich answers, and the idea of leadership not being static, and especially in the co-creation of culture, and how everyone in an organization and in community and everywhere is creating culture together. We're not outside of it. So it segues very nicely to the next question, actually. So thank you. I know that everyone did that on purpose. So we have one of two questions for question 3. What are some of the ways to show and build leadership skills if you are not a team or organizational leader? And then share how best to build towards or position yourself as a more senior leadership role such as yours. So we're going to start with Kat, then we'll go to Maggie, and then we'll finish with Sherry. So I'll give the floor to Kat.
Thanks. This is one of those questions when I read it, I'm like, sometimes the questions are complicated and the answers are simple. This is very much one of those questions, like, I really feel that there's just opportunity to step into a leadership position, whether you're in a leadership position yourself, you're in a team, you're an organization leader, whatever have you, like there is always room for leadership in that space. And what are some ways to actually show and build leadership skills? One of the things that I think that's really interesting with sports is that if you want to get better at soccer, you practice. Like you practice these leadership skills and you put them into play. That's how you get better in any type of skill set. That's the same with leadership. That's in any type of skill set in your professional development, is that you practice. So I think you just need to like demonstrate your ability and willingness to learn. I've always been most impressed from people that just ask like for just generative feedback. Like what are ways that I can step into a leader position, and explicitly asking. I think this is something that people typically don't do when they're not like already started in a managerial or leadership position, is that they just don't explicitly ask how to get there. Like, what do you need from me? What do you need to see from me? What do I need to demonstrate for me to step into this position? And then you tell them. And then one thing that I love about this framework as well is that after such time that you believe that you've actually demonstrated those qualities, asking them like, now what is stopping me from stepping into this managerial or leadership position? Because then you can hold like your manager accountable for actually saying this is what you needed, you demonstrated, and you actually have a pathway to actually move forward, of course. And I think one of the other things that I would talk about when I talk about leadership position is always being open to learning and building with community. Like I find that people that are strongest when they approach me with a potential for a leadership opportunity, it's when they come with a community backing around it. It's really hard for us to say no to having you step into a leadership position, however you choose to define it, if you have backing from an entire community that you've consulted with, because you come with more knowledge, more expertise, more of a backing behind you than we ever could. So of course you should step into that position. So I think it's really just a combination of just learning, asking, and just engaging with your community.
Thank you so much, Kat. Yeah, the ability to learn, I love that. And yeah, just the vulnerability that we talked about before. Now we are very quickly running out of time, probably because I talk over everyone, but I love what everyone's saying, but if we can stick to being like a little bit snappier, but also if you need to say something, you should say something more than me. So we are going to carry on with Maggie, please.
Definitely +1 to what Kat said. I feel like that was a really amazing summary. I think I would add, from my experience in leadership, it was partly about defining my own leadership style and recognizing that that is leadership, despite the fact that it's not the stereotypical white man with a cape patriarchal storyline of leadership. So, and for me, discovering my own leadership is partly about grounding it in the values of what's important to me as a leader, and partly about understanding what I'm really good at. And so I tried to bring those things together in defining and, like Kat said, practicing my leadership and strengthening my leadership muscles. I would also add, similar to Kat, my leadership journey started with meddling. Like, I was not given the job of doing X or Y. I was just like, oh, I see that someone needs to do X or Y. And in nonprofits or maybe small organizations, you can sometimes find those spaces where there's a gap that can be filled and you can step into it. And so that was definitely true for me. I was like meddling around in various kinds of leadership functions as a staff person and as a volunteer in various organizations. And that's partly how I grew my leadership skills. So giving myself these little self-imposed stretch assignments, and partly, as Kat said, taking on things that needed doing, and I thought I had something to offer in. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Maggie. Yeah, just practice and have people see you in the practice, right? And Sherry, we'll finish up with you.
Thanks. I'm gonna try to be super brief just because I know you had this tantalizing last question about barriers, and I'm really hoping we get to that. I guess I just want to say that I really appreciated Kat's metaphor on sports and the idea of practice. Also, like the way you get better often, not that I'm sporty, but is playing with people that are better than you. And I think understanding and really valuing the people for all their skills, their perspectives, their approaches, their lived experience around you, and understanding that that makes not just your strategy better, but your culture better, when everyone can see and be seen and appreciated, and that you really appreciate that you get to be on the field with these amazing people, be they community leaders, be they people in your team or your organization. And I guess the other thing is, I'm not sure if I'm getting this right, and I can't remember who said it, but like that, the idea that culture eats strategy for lunch. Like, I think if you're only paying attention to strategy and you're not paying attention to how, however you can show up and either exemplify the culture you want, or nudge it in that way, or make things visible that aren't working in as positive a way and without ego, I think you're missing those opportunities to step into leadership. Culture, like allowing people to fail and allowing people to be supported, to learn and to iterate and there's so many things, and that equality that moves from transactional to relational. I think all of those things are actually in the realm of culture, and strategy will rise or fall based on your culture. And everybody, as people have said on this panel, like everybody has the ability to bring that to the floor.
Oh, thank you, Sherry. Yeah, it's not just strategy versus culture. It's yes and culture is just so deeply important in our lives and in everything. So we do have 2 questions left, and yes, the last one is tantalizing, to quote Sherry. So for our second to last question, I am going to go off piste and say, let's just have it as one sentence. How hard could that be? So one sentence that if you had a mentor in your career, what was their best advice to you? Or what would you tell your younger self if you had, 10 seconds in a time machine to go, this is just a thing you'll understand later. So we'll start with you, Sherry. What would you tell baby Sherry, or what did a mentor once tell you that blew your mind?
Thanks. I guess who comes to mind is my father. He was a kid and he was swept up in the internment in BC, and really faced, they faced a lot of hardship. And his thing was like, it's okay, you just need a sense of humor, and you really need to know what you carry within yourself. And that way you have this steadiness and you're not in the waves of the up and down drama. So I just thought that was great advice, and I will pass it back.
Oh, Sherry, I want more than one sentence from you now, but thank you very much. And that's beautiful. Maggie, what is the one sentence or a couple that you can give us?
I love that, Jerry. Thanks. I had someone quite recently tell me, I meditate so I know what's important. And I think about that now because I will frequently do something meditative, like go for a walk, if I'm about to go into a meeting that's raised for me a bunch of mental or emotional turmoil, and I can go for that walk or focus my eyes on a pretty part of the neighborhood and stare into the distance for a minute, and it'll help sort out my mind in terms of what is essential for me to bring to that meeting and what isn't.
Thank you, Maggie. Yeah, very much like Sherry's dad, like finding that center and finding perhaps some humor before you go in as well. And we will finish with Kat.
I'm really bad at being concise. But I think the first thing is that not everybody's against you. More often people want to work in collaboration with you than not. So don't position anybody really quite as an enemy, just as somebody that perhaps need to be converted into the cause. And I think the second piece of advice that I would have given to myself when I was younger is develop like a personal board. It's one thing to have a mentor, but like a personal board of like people that know that are on your personal board, like who can help you career-wise, advice-wise, just rant about wise, professional wise, and like developing a good set of people. So you have like people outside of your organization, community, outside of different aspects of your life to just provide advice for you, because that was something that was hugely helpful for me when I was stepping into my current role.
Oh, Kat, I love that. I love hearing, yeah, the safety that comes from community around us, and having a personal board is very. I'm going to absolutely credit you, but take that. So we're going to open up the questions from anyone. You can raise your hand if you'd like, or you can have a Q&A. We really do want to engage our listeners. So we have like an extra special question. If no one has a question right now for us, we will get to it, Sherry, do not worry. But let's open it up. If anyone, you can write it in the chat as well. I know it's hard to have questions sometimes because truly I feel so fortunate to listen to everyone right now and have all of these amazing panelists here. Renata, do you see anything coming in, or?
No, we don't have anything in the chat quite yet.
Everyone's just going like, oh, you're all amazing. Okay, well, we wait for the chat because we do like, please ask us anything. And by us, I mean them. But we will, I'll prime the pump and just say, this is the question that we've been alluding to, because it's, you know, I think deeply important for all of us to talk about the strengths and community and collaboration, but also, you know, the realistic side of things. So what has been a significant barrier that you encountered in your career, and how did you navigate it? Let's start with Maggie.
Sorry, there's a pop-up that just came. Well, I won't say too much. I'll just say, probably I've already alluded to this. So it's about recognizing my own leadership as leadership, despite the fact that we're frequently told that a relational and vulnerable and empathy-based leadership is not really leadership. So that would be a journey that I've been on for quite a long time.
Every day is a school day. Okay, we do have a question that's just come in. So let's quickly finish up this question and then we'll answer this one. So Kat, would you like to speak to your significant barrier that you've encountered and how you navigated it?
Yeah, and I'll be brief as well. I mean, I work for a youth-led organization. We're youth-led youth serving, and it's the constant underestimation of the work and having to justify us being there all the time, which has been a huge barrier. There's almost this expectation that because we're a youth-led organization that we need to have even more impact. We need to prove that we belong here. There's also like this expectation that now you're a woman of color and you're young, so therefore you really need to like almost like shed light and speak on all of these topics that I might not be expert in. Like I often get asked about like specific like stop Asian hate, being a woman of color, but honestly, like my field is climate. So those are actually barriers in and of itself. So constantly being underestimated, but also being asked to speak on behalf of something that I might not be ready to speak on behalf is something that's a really interesting dynamic that I didn't expect to encounter when I was entering the space, and the constant need to justify us being there. I mean, in youth-led work, it's fairly common.
Thank you so much for your perspective and for continuing to show up. You know, there's like the emotional and professional burden that is trying to prove why you're there. And we will finish up with Sherry, and we have another question. So Sherry, this is your delicious opportunity.
Okay, and I will try to be brief. I also wanted to say, like, the personal board, I think, get a personal board. That's such a great idea. And I just wanted to kind of highlight too, like, thanks to Nature Canada and kudos to the cohort of women leaders that are meeting, because maybe you guys are each other's personal board, which is pretty cool. Okay, so in terms of barriers, I guess, I found this question, of all the questions that were sent, I found this one easiest, and I don't know if it's because for some reason it's kind of stuck in my head. But I mean, I know people have a lot of barriers that they experience throughout their career, no matter who they are. But there, you know, as we all know, there are also systemic barriers for women, Indigenous, Black, women of color, for trans and queer folks. And I think what I've noticed now or recently is that, you know, over the time of COVID and kind of coming out of it, I noticed that there's a lot more organizations looking for diverse leaders. Like, everyone wants their staff or their board photos to look more diverse. And it relates to what Kat was saying about, like, that responsibility, the weird responsibility to speak about things on behalf of a whole demographic. Anyway, like, you know, when there's more Indigenous, Black, and racialized leaders in the photo, people can pat themselves on the back. But if it's just the color of the faces or the gender diversity that changes, but the underlying culture doesn't change, there are going to be like big ass barriers that continue to block the progress for everyone. Because, like, if you hold back some, you're holding back all. Like, and what I mean about blocking progress, like, if someone diversifies you or hires you to diversify up their organizational photo and puts you in leadership, and then because of like the old culture or the way things are done around here, like, really only wants you to make decisions that an older, traditional, middle-aged white male or whomever might make, and not to rely on your experience and all else that you might bring, then that diversity is false and the barriers are immense. Like, I remember Anna Mae Paul, the former head of the Green Party, federal Green Party, said that she hadn't realized that when she broke the glass ceiling, she'd still have to crawl across glass shards. And after reading like Jody Wilson-Raybauld's book, Indian in the Cabinet, you can see how organizations, be they political parties or NGOs, can bestow like an insider status on people to diversify their photos or their cabinet or their staff or their board and pat themselves on the back for that. But there's a terrible price to be paid when those diverse leaders bring their whole selves to their roles, like their values, their perspectives from their lived experience, their accountability to communities that may supersede blind loyalty to an old boy or girl historic culture that dictates the way things are done around here. So I think it's really good if all of us can try to recognize those barriers, because we are getting more learning, and there's no perfect decolonize, there's no perfect justice. So it's kind of like we're all trying to dismantle this stuff together. So I'll pass it back.
Oh, thank you so much, Sherry. That is, you know, it's so important with the idea of decolonization and anti-racism and just everything. This idea that perfectionism is a lie of white supremacy and the patriarchy. So we must start somewhere. If not, we'll start when things get perfect. We do have a few questions that are coming in, and so I'm just going to open up to the panelists and who wants to answer, because a few of the questions are about imposter syndrome, and I think it actually weaves really nicely into what Sherry was just talking about. So, you know, the imposter syndrome, especially in these patriarchal ideas of leadership, of capitalism. So whoever would like to answer, do you have any advice on starting as in a new leadership role, a newly graduated biologist, feeling that there's lack of experience in such a role? You've just started out and perhaps you're feeling like you have imposter syndrome, or you want to make sure that you don't feel that way.
I feel like maybe this question was directed at me about imposter syndrome, so maybe I'll try to tackle it first. Imposter syndrome, it happens to everybody, it happens to me. Just last week, I was on a panel with like the CEO of like multiple foundations and like the social finance forum, and I was so terrified of being on this forum with like these people that obviously, in my perspective, are rock star people. And then, you know, this is, I think, to mimic the panel, as people start to speak, I realized the more that I am in my space, in my field, to realize, you know, getting older isn't necessarily like related to how much expertise you have in a specific area. Like you become a subject matter expert. Yes, you get this lived experience. Yes, but there is so much vibrancy and importance of sharing youth perspectives. So if you're younger in the space, like that is the strength. Like you're in community with young people. And it was only in those, like the reason people feel imposter syndrome is that they have not yet seen somebody like them in the space reflected as it is. So it's not imposter syndrome, it's this feeling that you don't belong there because so far a lot of society hasn't told you that you belong there, so you feel like an imposter. So it's culturally made, it's culturally woven, and to attack that is to allow yourself to be present, be like, you are invited here for a reason, you're put in this place for a reason, be in this position and do it with excellence as best as you can. I found that, you know, within that panel, for me personally, it was when I spoke up that I realized that I had so much to offer. And yes, maybe I took a spicy stance, is what I take spicy stances a lot of times. I'm like, be okay with challenging, combating mental models, norms, theses, because that is where innovation and systems change happen. And if you feel like you have imposter syndrome, I've always been telling myself it is because I have been made by society to feel like I'm an imposter in the system that I belong to.
Yes, Kat. Excellent final line. Drop the mic, get out of here. Yeah, I think these are such interesting points and such like really important points. This system, we're all steeped in this soup, right? So this system is meant to oppress us and also to lift us up, depending on our culture. Maggie has also written in the chat to answer some of the questions that are here, and she's answered made some really good points about intentionally building your network, and you know, especially like Nature for Canada and this Nature Canada, Women for Nature, the mentorships here, coming to these panel discussions, just to plug this, like I think it's so deeply important, because the more that we talk about this vulnerability, the more we talk about the leadership that all of us can have when we create this culture that we all get to have leadership, then there's less imposter syndrome, because we all realize none of us know everything. We're all getting from everyone else. It looks like we have exactly run out of time. So the next webinar is about, what a segue, is going to be about building networks, which again, so deeply important in leadership, in business, professionality, but then also just in your life. We're not supposed to do this alone, so why do it alone? Thank you so much, everyone, for participating. I really, really enjoyed the discussion. I have like pages of notes. I hope you learned something too. It was so valuable. A special thank you to the panelists, the experiences that you provided. There's such great insight here. So thank you so much for our emerging leaders in conservation and nature and wherever they go. Before we wrap up, our mentees, I have some important information for you. To visit the resource section of the mentorship platform, which you can see here. The next leadership webinar will be held in September. And like I said, it's building your networks. And so it's, finding the strength in you and in others to build up that network. I hope that everyone can attend. It's going to be amazing. Thank you so much. Have a great afternoon, and we'll see you in September. Thank you, everyone.